Hey everyone, so welcome to this last part of my recommendation for white against the King's Indian. And we're going to be covering two big variations. So after we get d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, and d6, we get the main position of the King's Indian. And here we're going to look at f3 again. And also don't mind in the background if you hear some sounds because that's from the mosque nearby. Anyways, in this position, after we look at castles, we've already covered bishop e3, and we've looked at various moves like, b6, a6, knight c6, the pano variation, a lot of theory there, but overall white is actually better in the pano. So the pano is no longer a serious option, for objectively speaking. But the main variation in this line is to equalize as this move c5, and this is the consensus. However, some people do play e5 in this position, which I think is already inaccurate. This is a very common move in the King's Indian, but I think that without the knight on f3 and with the pawn on f3, this changes a lot because white can close the center, and as a result, white center is really solid with this pawn on f3 defending it, and white can continue with the typical g4 h4 attack. Though there are some nuances here to be known. This was It's like basically since the 90s, this variation hasn't been played very often anymore because people understand that e5 is no longer a good move. In this position, c5 is possible. This is one of the sidelines. This is an important structure to know because I think even Fischer, back then when he played the King's Indian frequently, often chose this kind of setup, this type of idea. But in general, this move c5 really takes away from a lot of the counterplay black has against the center, because oftentimes black wants to play a move like c6 and then have the ability to take on d5. However, after pawn to c5, we see that this is no longer the case, and so white can actually focus their attack on the king side here. So white can start with g4. Let's say, for example, knight e8, trying to prepare f5, but now white plays h4 here, preparing h5 next. And one idea I looked at is bishop f6, but now I like the idea of just going bishop f2, just defending the pawn. And next we're gonna go h5, and if black ever plays g5, then we can always play h6. And in general, white is doing very well in these kind of positions. Overall, we can also just continue with like knight e2, h5, knight g3. If black pushes g5 themselves, then we can occupy the f5 square. And black is struggling in this kind of position. Additionally, we can also have the idea of, after bishop f6, to play queen d2, because now if you take on h4, then we have queen h2. For example, bishop takes h4, king d1, and queen h2 is already a big threat, so black has to play like g5, but now queen h2, and then followed by bishop f2, and black is already in serious trouble. So they can't really do that. Instead, after h4, the main idea is typically to play f5, and this is a very typical reaction, but I like the move gf5, just opening up the g file. After e takes f5, now we take on f5 with the idea that we're actually opening up the e4 square for our knight. So for example, after bishop takes f5, we can continue with queen d2, long castle, bishop d3, and then later stick a knight on e4. And with the open g file, eventually we can put our rook on g1, and this is going to be very dangerous for black. We can even continue with h5 and h6, right? So in general, this is not really a concern. c5 really takes away from any counterplay that black has. In this position, a typical move is trying to go knight h5, preparing knight f4. Even at the cost of a pawn, maybe black wants to do this. But in this position, even though the main move is queen d2, which is a good line after f5, long castles, let's say knight d7, bishop d3, just supporting the center, knight d to f6, we can play ef5, gf5, and then knight g2, with the idea eventually of maybe even pushing g4. And this is a different way to play, which gives white an advantage, though I prefer, in general, like as I mentioned, if there is a good line that really exits a lot of the theory and, is really unexplored, I will try to recommend that line, if it's also of high quality. So in this position, after checking with the engine, g4 turns out to be like a very dangerous idea, with the idea that we are not only kicking away this knight, but we're also controlling the f5 square, so if black ever plays f5, then we can take with the g-pawn. It does weaken control over the f4 square, but we can simply ignore it. For example, knight f4, and now we can even continue with h4. So I looked at a lot of moves in this position. One possible idea is bishop f6, hitting the h4 pawn, but now we can play even g5, shutting down the bishop, which is quite counterintuitive because we normally don't want to play a move like g5. But for example, bishop g7 will be met with queen d2. And we're just going to simply castle next with a good position. f5 is possible, you know, trying to create some counterplay, but we can simply castle. And if they ever take on e4, then we can always activate our knight. And eventually we have ideas of like knight g2 to trade off this knight on f4. And yeah, our typical idea of going for h5 is really a serious threat. So one interesting idea is a5, you know, trying to put the knight on a6 and the c5, very typical. But now we can go knight g2. And for example, our mistake here would already be knight takes e2, because after bishop takes e2, h5 is already coming. Even at the cost of the g5 pawn, it doesn't really matter, because, you know, the black king is under too much pressure. And while this bishop on g7 is just bad, because black is committed to the pawn to e5. So yeah, and so here knight h5 is possible, just coming back, for example. But yeah, it just looks very bad here, and we can just continue with like rook g1, preparing ideas of eventually, you know, knight g3, maybe b6 is possible, but it's slow. So we can, like, for example, take on f5, bishop takes f5, and then go knight g3 now, trading off an important defender of the black king. For example, knight takes, rook takes, knight e6, and now bishop d3. We're ready with the ideas of like h5, and we're playing bishop d3 before black is in time to play knight b4, you know, prevent our idea of bishop d3. And yeah, we have ideas of like bishop takes f5 followed by h5, and overall black is just struggling here. And yeah, there's a strong attack coming. So that should be fine. Instead of black plays the immediate knight a6, then we can already play this interesting move knight b5. And the idea is actually to solidify the center here and bring the other knight to c3 just to support the center and improve their own pieces. For example, now c6 is not possible because the d6 pawn is now hanging. If black plays knight c5, then we can simply take on c5 and then play d6, and we're simply breaking through here. Very typical King's Indian play, right? And instead, if they play b6 in this position, maybe trying to prepare knight c5 now, we can now play knight e to c3, and we just have a bind on the queen side, as well as a bind on the king side. And yeah, so anyways, bishop d7 here is possible, but now we just play king b1. And overall, we see that we have a bind with ideas of like bishop d3. We can take on c5 if the knight ever comes to c5, play a3, king a2, securing the king. And overall, yeah, if black ever takes on e4, then we can play even f takes e4. We can even consider that move and play bishop e2. Or in general, I like the move knight takes e4 better, because we just can occupy the e4 square nicely, while this bishop on g7 is just struggling. So what is managing to improve their pieces, it's a bit unusual to, you know, put your knight on b5, put your other knight to c3, but overall, white's position is very solid, and they have just better pieces. So yeah, instead of that, let's look at another move. Instead of bishop g7, bishop e7 may try to, you know, prevent white from, you know, trying to push h5, because now the g5 pawn is under attack. But now I like the idea of bishop takes f4, because now the bishop is no longer on this long diagonal, right? After e takes f4, we can now play queen d2, hitting the f4 pawn. f6 tries to undermine the g5 pawn, but now we can even strike further with h5, and we open up the king side completely. This is, you know, black is really lacking a lot of defenders on the king side as a result of putting the bishop on e7 instead of g7. So yeah, this is dangerous. Instead of bishop f6, it's also possible to create counterplay with c6 here, but this is kind of slow because white can immediately play h5. If they take on h5, then clearly after g takes h5, yeah, we just open up the g file here. For example, bishop h6 is the best move, but now we play queen d2, defending our bishop. Queen g5 is the best move, trying to unleash some discovered attacks on, you know, on our bishop maybe. But now we can long castle. Knight d3 is the best move, but now we can play simply king b1, which is a nice move just getting out of this diagonal. Queen takes e3, and now queen takes d3. And even with the exchange of queens, it's like black isn't managing to solve all their problems, because at the end of the day, yeah, their development is really lacking. They don't have really any great squares for most of their pieces. The king is also kind of weak here. So white has a better structure and a better position as a result. So that's g takes h5. Instead, g5 here really is a thematic move that I think we need to know how to face. But in a lot of positions, even not on the King's Indian, when black has played both e5 and g5, then the f5 square becomes weak. For example, in the Black Lion variation of like the Philidor, then oftentimes if black ever plays h6 followed by g5 and they also play e5, then the f5 square is a typical square that we want to take advantage of. So here now we can prevent black from closing up the position with h6 by playing h6 ourselves. bishop f6, and now knight g to e2. And we have the idea of, you know, playing queen d2 maybe later, maybe knight g3, bring the other knight from to d1 to e3, and then occupy the f5 square. And yeah, we just have like typical moves. Maybe even queen c2 is better to support the center further. And yeah, white just has a very nice position. So instead of c6 here, which is quite slow, f5 tries to create a lot of, you know, this is critical, clearly just lashing out at white center. But now we can typically play g takes f5. This is the idea of playing g4 in the first place. G takes f5, and now I like the move queen c2. Queen d2 looks a bit more natural, but I like queen c2 because it defends e4 and frees the back rank as well, you know. It's just a tiny bit better than queen d2, I believe. And after knight d7, with the idea of knight d to f6, trying to support the king side, maybe take on e4 at a certain time, we can play long castles, knight f6, and now this very nice move h5, with the idea of pushing h6 if we're allowed to. And if we get to play h6, then the bishop is forced to go back to h8. And so the critical move is clearly to take the pawn on h5, knight 6 takes h5. Now we can take on f4, very unusual, but the point is the other knight is forced to recapture if they don't want to lose the knight to the rook. Knight takes f4, and then now knight g to e2. And so even at the cost of a pawn, we can see that it's no problem here because we're exchanging a lot of the defenders of the black king, and as a result, we're clearly much better here. Both the g and h files are now open as a result of even sacrificing the h pawn. So very difficult for black to defend, clearly. So that's the idea of knight h5. Instead of black plays the immediate move c6, which is the main move, we can continue with queen d2, very typical ideas of long castle, maybe like, you know, not really bishop h6, I believe, because bishop h6 is really only played if we're already like advancing with g4, h4, h5. You know, we don't typically want to play the bishop to h6 here when black, you know, has already closed up the center this way, because this is quite a bad bishop as compared to, you know, a lot of dragon positions where we do want to exchange the bishops. With the pawn on e5, this is actually a bad bishop. So here c takes d5 is trying to release the tension, but now the main point is that we take with the c pawn, and as a result we keep our solid center, and oftentimes we don't even need to castle because we can really create quick counterplay on the king side. After a6, this is the main move, trying to prepare b5. Now we can continue with g4. Our king is perfectly safe on e1 here. If black plays h5, our typical response here is to play h3, just keeping the tension here. And the idea is to eventually take on to play knight g to e2, maybe bishop g5 to pin the knight, and then later take on h5 here, maybe with the knight on g3, ideally. But otherwise, we can also just like, you know, take on h5 eventually and play rook g1, and with a very dangerous attack down the g file. So that's the typical idea. If black plays knight bd7, we can play knight g to e2, preparing knight g3 next, so that now so the black is never able to play h5 because we can take twice. And after h5 here, now we get the, you know, typical response to h3. H4 is never really possible because of bishop g5 picking up the pawn. Knight h7 is interesting, which is the best move, trying to prevent white's attack. But now here we can play a4 even. I like spending time here to prevent b5, preventing any counterplay, and just like really restricting black's play. Yeah, if knight c5 ever comes, then we can always just either move the queen to c2 or even move the knight to c1. And here, after queen h4 check, we can play bishop f2. If black plays the move queen g5 here, I like the move a5. And even though we exchange the queens here, it doesn't really save black from all the troubles because we have a bind on both the king side and the queen side as a result of our extra space. So it's a very nice position. Instead, if they play queen f6, try and put pressure on f3, then we can play bishop g2. Sooner or later, this is necessary, even though our bishop doesn't look great. Knight to g5, attacking f3, but now we can castle. With the point that f3 is no longer is actually not able to be taken because we can take and then play bishop g3, just simply trapping the queen. So instead of knight takes f3, h takes g4 is better, but now we can play f takes g4, opening up the f file here. And so after queen d8 coming back, we can now play pawn to b4. We're preventing knight c5, we're ready to play a5 next. We can even have this typical idea of like moving the king to the corner and bringing the knight to g1 to f3. Trade off this guy, remove a key defender, and, you know, just improve the position from both sides of the board. We don't even need to go for the king side attack here because we have a nice bind on the queen side. So, you know, play on the queen side, rook fc1, bishop e3, pawn to a5, and a very good position. Okay, so that's if knight h7. If pawn to b5 here, trying to immediately create counterplay before white is able to play a4, then now we can play bishop g5. This is a typical idea we'll see in the main line as well, where we're threatening to play g takes h5 now since the knight cannot take on h5. And so after queen a5 here, and in this position, it's possible to play the move knight c1. And yeah, Tomaszewski won a nice game in 2009 here. And I was considering this, you know, just trying to keep more pieces on the board. But I think the move knight d1 is actually a very nice move, trying to enter an endgame. For example, if black trades the queens here, queen takes d2, king takes d2, knight to c5, then we have the nice move knight to f2, where the knight is very nicely placed to actually support the center, both the g4 and e4 pawns. We have the idea of playing knight c1 to d3, exchanging off black's best piece. And because black has played e5, again, oftentimes we see that the bishop on g7 is just struggling. So we simply have like better pieces as a result of this. White should be clearly better. So yeah, if black avoids the queen exchange with b4, then now we can play knight g3. And the threat is to simply take on h5 here, opening up the king. So knight h7 was played by Kasparov once against Ivanchuk. But now we have the move bishop e7, which is actually an improvement with the fork. If black plays rook e8, then simply bishop takes d6, and the b4 pawn also falls next. Instead, if black plays h4, trying to distract the bishop by taking on h4, we can now even play knight e2. Simply, like, it's more important to take the d6 pawn than to take the rook. Because if we take the rook, then black is going to have control over all the dark squares, right? So we really want to focus on taking this pawn rather than the rook. Knight c5 tries to at least activate the knight, threatening knight b3, but we'll see that this is actually okay. After we take on d6, rook d8, we can even come back with bishop e7 because we need to understand we don't really want to give up our dark squared bishop. But if black plays bishop f6, which is the only move, but it's not easy. Now and only now, because black has spent so much time, you know, moving the rook over, and we've grabbed like a very critical d6 pawn, we can now take the rook and then play knight c1, preventing knight b3 with the fork. Now we can even play knight e3, followed by knight c4, attacking the queen, improving the knight's position, bishop e2, and then castles. And black is doing very poorly here. So yeah, it's a very nice position for white. Up a lot of material. Instead, if black plays rook e8, just trying to save the rook, now we can play bishop takes h4, and we're up 2 pawns here. We are allowing knight b3, but after a takes b3, we sacrifice the exchange and go knight c1, with the idea of going bishop c4 and short castle next. And white has a passed d6 pawn, the bishop here, you know, in an open position, semi-open position, and just better minor pieces overall. The queen is also stranded on a1 here. This is going to be a very difficult position for black to defend. So instead of all these complications, let's see, knight g2, knight bd7, yeah, that basically covers this move, pawn to c6, and this entire variation of pawn to e5. We can see that in all of the lines, black is not managing to equalize because at the end of the day, this bishop on g7 just becomes bad if they're not able to take on d4, and we'll not allow them to take on d4 because we will play d5. So yeah, that's the general gist of it. The main move to equalize here, according to theory, is the move c5. And in this position, I will recommend one of two moves. The move d takes c5, which enters an endgame, which is, it sacrifices, this is a pawn sacrifice from black, and black is known to equalize here. However, I don't think it's as easy as a lot of people think it is, because I think a lot of people just play c5 because they think it's okay, and they don't really know how to play with the compensation here. But, so we will look at this in depth, but the main move is knight g to e2, just maintaining the pressure, the tension in the center. The move d5 isn't really great here because the knight hasn't come to c6, right? Meaning that we haven't kicked away the knight, and so black can play e6, and basically we get a very typical and good version of the Benoni for black. For example, queen d2, e d5, cd5, pawn to a6, preparing b5. So now we play a4, rook to e8, knight g to e2, knight bd7, knight g3, and the pawn to h5. And yeah, just in general, these kind of Benoni positions are fine for black if white tries to play, a transposition from the Sämisch into the Benoni. I think in general, black is doing fine in most, if not all, variations. So that's not what I would recommend. Instead, I would recommend either d takes c5, which we're going to look at first, testing your opponent basically on how much theory they know, in this resulting endgame. After dc5, we can trade on d8 first, forcing the queens off the board. Rook takes d8, and now bishop takes c5. And now knight c6 is the only move, defending the e7 pawn. And in this position, there are a lot of moves, but you can check that in the PGN below. But in this recommendation, I will be recommending the move rook to d1, which is, I think, a safer move that doesn't intend to actually keep the pawn, but instead tries to keep the bishop here as a critical asset. Because in the line with knight d5 here, which is a tricky move, tried by Karpov a few times, knight takes d5 is a mistake because, for example, cd5, bishop takes b2, rook b1, bishop c3, king f2, bishop b6 is possible. After bishop a3, I think that this position is kind of dangerous for black in a sense, because essentially, even though our king is a bit, out in the wild here, essentially white has a nice center and has his bishop on this long diagonal. So we're eventually going to be able to pick up the e7 pawn, and this is quite dangerous. So knight takes d5 is not possible. If knight d7 here, we can now take on e7, knight takes e7, knight e7, king f8, and then now knight comes back to d5, which will, white will be a pawn up eventually after black takes on b2. But we have, the c4 pawn is going to be kind of weak. Our bishop on f1 becomes kind of bad, and we have no open diagonals for it. So this is not too difficult to prove compensation, in my opinion, which is why I would like to recommend the move rook d1 if you want to enter this line, with the idea that after, black takes on d1, which isn't necessarily forced, but this is the critical line here, after king takes d1, if white is able to play one move like king c2 and, is able to consolidate bishop e3, knight g2 e2, knight comes to f4, eventually occupying the d5 square when allowed, then white is going to be actually much better in this kind of position because they are up a pawn at the end of the day. But instead, black has to move knight d7 here, and we have to play the move bishop f2. Why bishop f2? Because if we play bishop e3, then after black takes on c3 and plays knight d2 e5, or after the bishop comes to e6 and black is able to take on c4 with the knight, we really want to play knight to e2, but we don't really want our bishop to get hit, right? Which is why actually, in retrospect, in this position, it's important to play the move bishop f2. So once black takes on c3 and plays knight d to e5, we can at least play knight to e2. So our bishop is not going to get attacked after they take on c4. In this position, f5 has been tried once, but now we can take on f5. Bishop takes f5 and then knight d4, and I think white has a nice edge, has a nice advantage here. After rook d8, king c1, bishop d3 is possible here, but now we can take on c6, b takes c6, and now bishop d4, and this causes some problems. For example, takes, knight takes c4, now rook e1 targeting e7, and overall we see that all black's pawns are kind of just weak. They have like 4 pawn islands compared to our 3 pawn islands. We have the bishop in an open diagonal, and so, for example, king f7, rook e4, with ideas of rook h4 possibly, and we have a nice edge here. So instead of that, knight d3 was played once, but after bishop takes d3, knight takes c6, b takes c6, we can play rook d1 here, and we're putting pressure on the d file. We're also attacking the a7 pawn. If black plays a6 here, then they're already losing actually after rook takes d3. A very nice move, which was missed by Gawain Jones in this game in 2022. Rook takes d3, and now bishop d4, and the rook is completely trapped. And eventually, after e5 is played, king c2, rook takes, c takes, e takes d4, and now c5. Very nice move, just isolating all of the pawns. White soon won with king d3 and simply taking the pawn on d4. So even a King's Indian specialist like Jones was able to lose this way in an endgame, which is why I kind of wanted to look into this direction. It's a possible line that can surprise your opponent as well, because not many people will want to allow this, variation which is accepted to be equal, but it's actually trickier than it first seems. In this position, the best move is king f7, but after we take the pawn on a7, pawn to e5, and we come back with bishop e6, we're simply going to be 2 pawns up. We can play pawn to c5, a4, a5, and despite black may be able to block the light squares here, preventing our pawn from going to a6. At the end of the day, we are up 2 pawns, and we have more freedom to be able to make use of this material advantage. So yeah, that's the move f5. I think that white has a very nice edge, at least. Instead, knight takes c4 is the immediate move, but now we can play knight f4. preventing both bishop e6 and maybe trying to occupy the d5 square. Black has a lot of moves in this position. I look at knight d6, which is possible, but now we can play pawn to c4, which does shut down our own bishop, but at the end of the day, we are getting a big grip on the d5 square. And so I do like this position for white. I think more work can be done, but in general, black is kind of struggling. Instead of that, if knight b6, then I think the knight is actually quite poorly placed on b6. We can simply play king c2, and white can eventually occupy d5 if the pawn structure is fixed and white is able to play, get the pawn on d5 and then play pawn to c4. White is already much better. White has the bishop here right now, and I think this is a tiny edge that white can play for. Instead, knight 4 to e5 is actually best, which, is not... it's kind of difficult to find the reason why this is the best move as compared to other moves. But after, let's say, king c2, king f8, and knight d5, we are ready to actually kick away the knight from the e5 square by playing f4. After bishop d7, we can even play bishop c5, just improving our bishop. After, let's say, b6, we play bishop a3. And we have ideas of bishop a6, cutting out the c8 square, or even just bishop e2 followed by rook d1. And white has the bishop pair here and a tiny, tiny edge. So, yeah, that essentially covers this secondary recommendation of taking the pawn in this main line. It's possible, and I think that more work can be done here, but because I will be recommending the move knight g to e2, more in the spirit of the Sämisch, I think I'll be covering this in more detail. In this position, the main move is clearly knight c6. If they play c takes d4, this is really just enters a Maroczy bind, which is not in the wheelhouse for most King's Indian players. But after knight takes d4, let's say knight c6, bishop e2, I'll just give a couple recommendations here. For example, we're going to look at a couple lines. Knight takes d4 followed by bishop e6 is possible. And this is a theoretical line, but in general, I think white is doing quite well. White can castle, play b3, and in general, they just want to avoid the exchange of pieces if possible, and just maintain the nice piece advantage. But this is not, this is not really the King's Indian anymore. This is more of something you would get out of the Sicilian. So that's definitely worth looking at. Knight h5 is interesting, and I think this is another move that needs to be looked at. But in general, the most common move is bishop d7. But now I like castling. If black plays a6 here, trying to prepare some b5 at some point, by taking on d4 and playing b5, we can play queen d2. Defending the knight on c3 at some point. This is important. And after knight takes d4, because we are preparing to play the move knight c2 now, to avoid the exchange of pieces once we have connected the rooks. But so instead, the best move here is knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and queen a5. But now we play a3, followed by b4 next. And I think white has a nice edge here, at the very least. Instead of a6, queen b6 is possible, putting some pressure on the diagonal. But now this is strategically it's very risky because the queen is quite vulnerable here. So now we can play king h1, just getting out of danger. And we're ready to play either rook b1 here or even knight takes e6, potentially winning a pawn like knight takes e7 is next. So if black takes on b2 here, we can play first off knight takes knight e4, and actually the queen is trapped. So if they play queen a3, we can play bishop c1, queen b4, bishop d2, queen a3, and then now knight b5, simply trapping the queen. So instead of that, queen takes a1 is best, takes, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and bishop takes a4. And now black has gotten, a rook, a knight, and a pawn for the queen. But after queen b2, we're targeting b7 already. We have a material advantage. We're taking control of the long diagonal, preventing black from moving their knight on f6. And we have the nice Maroczy bind here, preventing black's d5 and b5 breaks. So also notably, we have the bishop pair. And so black is not the only one with that asset. So white has a nice advantage here. Instead of bishop takes b2, knight g4 is an interesting try, trying to get out of the pin tactically. After f takes g4, bishop takes d4 is already a mistake here because we can play knight d5, an intermezzo. Queen takes b2, and then now rook b1, where then queen needs to keep defending the bishop, and this is no longer possible. So instead of that, knight takes d4 is best, but now we can play queen d2. And the queen is still under this pin, so this is quite annoying. After knight c6, we can play knight d5, bishop d5, cd5, and if black is not playing e5 right now, then we're gonna simply play rook d1 with taking advantage of this pin. So we're gonna win there. So black needs to play e5 now. But after we play d6, fe6, rook f to d1, pawn to e5, we now have the open diagonal for our bishop. So bishop c4 check, king h8, and then now pawn to h3, just defending the g4 pawn, giving some luft for the king. I have rook ac8, rook ac1. White has a nice bishop pair here. The bishop on g7 is very bad. There's a weakness on d6 as well as the pawn on b7. So white can consider like a move like bishop d5 or even pawn to b3. And we just get a very nice position here with the bishop here and fighting against this bad dark squared bishop. So yeah, we just have a nice advantage here as well, though it's not as clear cut as a lot of the other variations, though it is nice still. So yeah, instead of that, let's look at the other move instead of c6 d4, which is the move knight c6, which is accepted to be the equalizer in this line. But after d5, here, an interesting move is knight a5 here, this is very typical in the Pano variation, trying to attack c4, but in this position it's not so great because we can play b3, and the knight on a5 just becomes very poor. Black normally tries to play a6 and b5 here, so we can play rook c1, just getting the rook out of the long diagonal. So now b5 is still not possible, so now rook b8 is typical. And now we can play knight g3, and b5 is already prevented because our bishop is covering that square. Bishop d7, trying to prepare b5 again, but now I like to move bishop d3. So basically the queen can come to e2, a bit of a strange configuration, but the point is we're trying to control the c4 square. So for example, b5 is typical. Now we can castle, and we don't even want to take on b5 because after black takes on c4, we still have a very solid structure. Rook b4 is possible, but now the point is queen e2, and we have a very nice solid structure, a very nice solid center. Black does get control over the b file, but I don't think that black is able to take full advantage of this, because at the very least, if black tries to double up or put some pressure on the b file, we can always play rook c2 to cover it. And we have, our idea here is to play h3, covering the g4 square, followed by f4 and e5. And yeah, we get a really nice position here. Knight can come to c1 to f2, very typical Sämisch play. And we get a nice position. So yeah, I think instead of, for example, queen b6 here, threatening rook b2 can also be met with immediate knight d1. So that's quite nice, preventing knight b2, and the pressure down the b file is no longer an issue. So yeah, that's this typical idea. But knight a5 is not common at all. Has been tried a few times, but not with great success. Instead, knight e5 is the main move by far, and now white will play knight g3. So we actually looked at this variation in the introduction video on the Sämisch, where we saw this line with e6, bishop e2, e takes d5, c d5, and then we saw the move a6, a4, and then h5. So yeah, if you want to look, into the main points of this variation, or like how white can actually get a really nice advantage in one of the games, in one of the model games, then please look at that game below, or the one that I will link up here. But yeah, essentially there are a lot of improvements that could be made from that game between, I think it was the Swedish player Beinziger who played this line. And let's look at the possible deviations. After knight g3, in this position, e6 is the first move that we covered in the introduction, but there's actually an improvement, which is this move h5 immediately. And this was the move recommended by Gawain Jones in his chessable course on the King's Indian. Now, I think that this is essentially the only line that can fully equalize in this mainline panel. In this mainline c5 variation. Now, after the point of h5 immediately is that white has not played the move bishop e2, and thus cannot castle immediately. And so, for example, if you compare this with e6, then after bishop e2, and let's say ed5, cd5, and h5, white can castle here. And they're ready to meet h4 with knight h1 to f2 and get a nice position, as we already covered. However, if black plays immediate h5 here, the idea is that after we play bishop e2, they're ready with h4 immediately. And so our knight is forced to go to f1, which is not ideal. Now, the h4 pawn becomes really weak, but according to theory and concrete variations here, black is able to equalize with this line. So, what is the main point of this variation? The main point is not to play the move pawn to h3, because in response to this, we can play g4. and we're ready to play g5 followed by f4, and these knights are really unstable. So that's not the point. h3 is not the point. The point is after e6, the switch of the move order means that this knight is on f1 instead of h1. And on h1 it can go to f2, while on f1 it can only go to e3. And on e3 it isn't as good as if it was on f2, because it's like kind of competing for squares with this bishop on e3. So in this position, I would like to recommend the main critical test to this line, which is the move bishop g5, putting pressure on the knight on f6. Again, if black plays h3, which looks quite disruptive, instead of pawn to g4, the best move is actually knight e3. Now, yeah, okay, like g4 is possible here, but yeah, essentially knight to e3 for some odd reason is the best move. And after h6 g2, we can play knight takes g2 with the idea of preparing f4 next with a big initiative. Queen a5, for example, creating counterplay, white can castle, and the king is safe here. White is ready with f4 next. For example, ed5 is possible, cd5, and again, we're ready with like f4, knight e3, king h1, and just with a very good position. c4 is a typical move trying to carve out the c5 square and this long diagonal for maybe the queen, as well as maybe he's trying to stick a knight on d3, you know, removing white's bishop here. And so here I recommend the move f4. If black plays queen c5, this is not really good because we can play king h1, knight e to g4, and then we have the nice move bishop h4 with the threat of pawn to e5 here actually to win a piece, because after they take and take on e5 again, the knight on f6 is actually hanging because of this open f file. So yeah, we have the threat of e5 here and black is in trouble. Instead of queen c5, knight e to d7 is best, but now we play f5, and this is a very typical idea. This is like a typical idea in the Benoni. White puts pressure on the f file. White can play queen e1 followed by queen h4 maybe, or even go to queen c2 to put, you know, possible pressure on the g6 pawn with the queen on c2. White can also play a3 in case black plays b5, preventing any b4 advances, and yeah, white has a very nice position here. So yeah, that's if this line with h3 is played. Instead, e takes d5 is possible. This is actually the line that Dan, you know, the bishop pair from Twitter actually liked, and he recommended this when we corresponded on Twitter. And yeah, this is also a good line for black, but I think that white has a teeny tiny edge. In one or two lines, it does equalize with, like, you know, very active play, but to get to that point of equalizing, black is the one that needs to find all of these moves. So after e takes d5, we can occupy this d5 square with the knight. And the idea is not even to play h3 again, because now we can play g takes h3, let's say bishop takes h3, and then now rook g1, with the idea of like queen d2, long castles. And here, the problem is that if black is not careful, then this pin on this knight is really annoying. So one way to get out of this pin is to play queen a5, but now we can play the move pawn to b4, and we're actually going to win some material if black's not careful. For example, if they take on b4. So now they can come back with d8, and so the idea is that now they've kind of provoked pawn to b4, so long castling is a bit more dangerous, right? But simply we play knight f to e3, and we have a nice advantage here because we're able to play pawn to f4, pawn to f5. We can still play queen d2 and long castle if necessary, you know, if black plays a slow move. And the positional idea here is even to take on c5, release the tension, so we don't really need to worry about black ever taking on b4. And we have a nice bind here with the beautiful knight on d5. So our pieces are just essentially better. That's the main point of why white is the one that's pushing here. Instead, after rook g1, the best move is the counterintuitive bishop takes f1, trying to exchange some pieces, but it doesn't work. After rook takes f1, white has the idea still of like queen d2, long castle, h4, h5, and yeah, it's a very difficult position because of this bishop on g5, putting a lot of pressure on the knight. So the idea is not pawn to h3. Black really needs to play actively, and they need to develop with bishop e6. And now they are sacrificing the h4 pawn, but the idea is to play this move b5, which is a very crazy move, but very typical, you know. The point is if we take on b5 with the pawn, then black plays bishop takes d5, and we're forced to take back on d5 with the pawn, and this is not desirable because this pawn becomes weak, and our king is very exposed in this kind of open board. So, for example, queen a5 here is already very dangerous, I think. So instead of that, we play bishop takes f6, a very interesting move, but the point is to remove the knight that was pressuring our knight on d5. After bishop takes f6, now we can take on b5. And we're ready to play knight f to e3 next, so black needs to really take on d5 right now. If black plays a6, then we can play b takes a6. Now, the main point is to kind of get this kind of, Benko Gambit-like compensation. But after bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and rook b8, now we can play rook b1. And I think, in general, white has an edge in these lines because the knight is coming to e3. We can castle if black is not careful, and we are up 3 pawns at the end of the day. So this is quite dangerous and not equalizing. So black needs to take on d5 here, which is the only line. After queen takes d5, in like around depth 31, the computer recommends this move c4, and this is the top choice apparently. But white has a clear edge after knight e3, hitting the c4 pawn. The idea is to play queen b6 so that now if we can't castle here, our knight is also under attack. But now we can take on c4. And I think the complications favor white. After knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, black takes on b2, we play rook b1, the bishop comes back to e5, putting some pressure on the h2 pawn, maybe bishop f4, but now we have the nice move king e2. Now in this position it seems like black has, decent compensation, but they are down 2 pawns. So white is preparing to play g3 next to cover the dark squares, preventing ideas of bishop f4. If black plays bishop f4 now, we can always play queen d3, covering the e3 square. We want to consolidate. Essentially, if black plays rook h to c1 or rook h to c8, rook h to c8, or rook a to c8, then we're gonna play rook h to c1, and we're gonna fight for control over the c file. We're gonna consolidate queen d3, pawn to a4, maybe bishop comes back to b3 sometimes, and at the end of the day, we are up 2 pawns, and the computer says that this is around almost a plus 0.5 advantage. So yeah, I'm sure that black has managed to equalize at some point in the game, but this is not an easy position. So yeah, white is comfortably better here. So instead of pawn to c4, actually the best move at a deeper depth is this move rook c8, with the idea that they want to push pawn to c4. So after we play knight e3, very typical, the idea is to play pawn to c4. And in this variation, we have to find the only move queen d1 here, which is unusual, but the idea is that we are getting our queen out of the possible threat of rook c5. We're also clearing up the d5 square for our knight maybe. And the point is that if we play queen d2, which would be ideal, black wins after c3. bc3 and knight takes f3, unleashing a discovered attack on the pawn on c3 and winning our queen. So that's not possible. So instead queen d1 is best. And black plays queen a5, trying to disrupt our development. So now we have to play king f1. And in this position, if they take on b5 with the queen, then after b3, black is struggling here because the pawn on c4 is in a pin. After knight d3, blocking the pin, we can play rook b1 with a nice advantage here. So instead of queen takes b5, black should play knight d3, but now we eliminate it, take on d3, bishop takes b2, and now rook d1. And in this variation, the best move is rook c3, attacking the queen and the knight. So now we can play queen e2, attacking the bishop. And at a deeper depth, this move rook b8 is managing to equalize, but black has to sacrifice the bishop on b2 temporarily, so that they're able to take the knight on e3. And after the complications, for example, queen takes b2, rook takes e3, king f2, activating the king, our king does get kicked around a bit. Like we can go to eventually g3, as we will see, rook a3, queen f6, rook takes a2, king g3, and queen takes b5. At some point, black is going to play queen e5 and is able to trade off the queens. So we should probably play a move like h4 here, trying to give our king some loof. Maybe ideas of h5 are possible, but black is equalizing after queen e5. So takes, rook d5, rook b to b2, and now rook g1. So at the end of the day, this is equal, but to get to this point, black needed to find a lot of moves, and it's overall a very testing variation, I believe. With good preparation, they're managing to equalize, but you can ask yourself, when's the last time that you got exactly 32 moves of preparation on the board? So I'd be happy to recommend this, not to a computer, but to humans in general. Instead of rook c3, queen takes e2 is possible, but now I like the move queen to e2, just pinning the bishop. And so rook c3 is best, putting some pressure, king f2, and now we have the threat of rook d2. And as typical in this line is that our king kind of squirms a bit. It maybe goes to g3 sometimes if kicked away, but we're going to be quite safe there, and we are still creating some threats. For example, after queen a3, unpinning, knight to g4, covering the e5 square, so that now, you know, any possible retreats with the rook and then bishop e5 is not possible, since we can simply take it. After queen c5, we can go queen g3, king g3, and at least we're covering this e5 square from queen e5 check, right? After rook c2, we can play queen e3, and the exchange of queens here I think gives white a tiny edge, because for example rook c5, trying to pick up the pawn back, and now we have the move pawn to b6. Just trying to exchange the pawns so that after a takes b6, we can play even rook d3. So yeah, we can't take on d6 here because the bishop e5 check is unfortunate, but now we play rook d3 with the threat of rook b3. And I think that white has a tiny edge in this position. Objectively it is equal, but we are able to create some threats against these two weak pawns. So instead of queen takes a2, yeah, essentially, yeah, these are the two lines in this critical variation. Either rook c3 or queen takes a2 immediately, right? And yeah, black is equalizing, but it's not easy to get to this point. So yeah, that's essentially this line, this critical line in this e takes d5 followed by bishop e6 variation. Instead, the move recommended by Gawain Jones is the main line with the move queen b6, putting pressure on b2 and getting out of the pin, so that now e takes d5 is possible without running into, you know, knight takes d5 and a lot of pressure on this pin. So now white plays queen d2, defending b2, e takes d5, and here's the idea. White can take on d5 with the pawn, but this line with h3, g4, knight h7, bishop goes back to e3, queen d8, knight g3, and queen h4. This is managing to equalize, and I think this is an interesting way to kind of like challenge your opponent if you want to ask them if they know this maneuver, right? It's very atypical to like to have this idea of, you know, queen comes to b6 and the queen comes back to d8 and the queen comes to h4. But this line is managing to equalize. So this is a possible test if you want to play this. But bishop takes f6 is a bit more challenging, forcing the bishop to an unfortunate position on f6, knight takes d5, and now queen d8. And in this position, I like just taking on f6, removing the bishop here, queen takes f6, and then now knight e3. And I think that if white is able to play one more move, like knight d5, then they're going to be able to claim at least a slight advantage, because there is a weak d6 pawn, there is a nice outpost on d5. But knight c6 is a very nice move that is able to equalize, because black is going to stick a knight on d4, and they're going to close the d-file pressure. So this is equalizing. But look at the following position. Long castle hitting the d6 pawn, knight d4, establishing a nice knight on the center. Now white plays the move rook h to f1. So in this position, we see that white has ideas of either pushing the pawn to f4 or even g4. You know, h6 g3, h6 g3 with a nice with a nice pawn mass on the king side. And so white can also continue with like bishop d3 next, and it's not as easy as like I think the computer would like to make it out to be. So yeah, if you look at the study, you will see possible lines of how this game can continue. But one idea is for black to eventually go for like bishop d7 followed by b5. But overall, I think that white is managing to put a bit of pressure at least. And to get to this point is not easy at all. So I'm happy to recommend this, although it is, you know, as you see in the correspondence database, 95% draws. I'm not surprised, but it is a bit unpleasant, I believe. So that covers this like the most critical test, which is this move h5 on the ninth in the ninth position. On the ninth move. Instead, most common is to play this move, the immediate e6, which is very typical in the Benoni. But as I mentioned before, this is less critical because white can play bishop e2. If black plays a6, this will easily transpose, after e takes d5. But the question is, what happens if black does not play e takes d5 at all, right? First off, I think we should play prevent b5 by playing a4, pawn to h5, and now we gain castle. So, yeah, black definitely shouldn't take on d5 here. Black should definitely take on d5 here, because at the end of the day, their bishop's going to get open and they're going to control the g4 square. But what happens if they don't? They can play knight h7 here, and we follow the same line without the move e takes d5 included. We can continue, and we can see that f4 is actually very annoying. And so we see that the point is black needs to take on d5 early on. E takes d5 is possible, But now, instead of c takes d5, which is automatic normally, we can play knight takes d5. After knight g4, we can take on g4, bishop takes g4, and now queen d3. Where now basically the b2 pawn is not for grabs because we can play rook b1, picking up the b7 pawn instead. And we have ideas here of like ripping the black king open with f5, and also the knight going to e2 to c3 to support the knight on d5. And here it's a different kind of advantage, but white is better. So this is why black definitely should take on d5 sooner or later if they decide to play e6. So after e d5, c takes d5. If they play h5 now, then we can castle with the same ideas in the main line. So this will transpose. But if they play a6 here, we can include the move a4. Doesn't really change much. Black can surely play bishop d7, trying to prepare b5 this way. Let's say h3, which is a nice move preparing f4. If black plays knight h5, which is played once actually in 2020, with the idea of getting this strange pawn structure, g takes h5, castles. But I think white can claim a clear edge in this kind of position. Say knight g6 and the pawn to f4. The game gets a bit interesting after f5, but after taking the pawn to h5, I doubt that black has managed to equalize here. Like, I highly doubt it. So instead of knight h5, knight e8 is possible. Maybe opening up the queen's diagonal. But now we can castle. And also black is preparing f5 to kind of break the position. In case of f5, we can always play f4. And so we see the main point of playing h3, and the problem of bringing this knight out to e5 is that it's very vulnerable here. After knight f7, we can take on f5, forcing gf5, and overall this pawn on f5 just becomes a big strategic weakness. So black isn't equalizing there. Instead, they can play b5, trying to gambit a pawn. But now we can focus on kicking the knight away, knight f4, knight c4, bishop takes, b takes, and now e5 is very nice. Very typical. After d takes e5, okay, I mean, we have the idea of playing e takes d6 here, so now d takes e5 is possibly forced, but now we can take on c5, trapping the rook here. After ef4, we can take on f8, bishop takes f8, and rook f4, with the c4 pawn falling. Let's say bishop d6, rook f3. Okay, our knight is under pressure. Black does have the bishop here, but we are up in exchange after all, and we have the potential of putting a knight on e4 here. A lot of weaknesses in black's position, so black is not equalizing there. Instead of knight e8 here, the best move is to play b5 immediately, which is the main point of like playing bishop d7 to begin with. But I like the move castles. If black plays rook b8, then we can see that black is trying to take on a4 eventually and then put some pressure down the b file. But now I like the move f4 again, forcing the knight to come to c4, only move. But now we can take on c4, play queen d2, and we have ideas of playing f5 next. Very typical, like in Benoni fashion. After knight e8, we can also play e5 here. And black is under some serious pressure. This is seen actually in the game Tomaszewski versus Kiev in 2008. And this is already a very critical position. If black takes on e5, then after bishop takes c5, again, we go into a very similar variation as we saw before. We win the rook. So instead f5 is best here, but now this allows the pawn to come to e6, bishop c8, rook f to e1, and we have ideas of like, bishop takes c5 followed by e7 with the fork, so black needs to play a move like queen b6, but now rook ab1, and it seems like black is managing to get like some decent play here for, in exchange for white getting this insanely strong pawn center. But at the end of the day, this pawn on c4 is weak. White can always improve their pieces. For example, this knight on g3 isn't exactly great right now, so white can slowly improve. Knight f1, knight h2, knight g3, knight f3, covering the g5 square. The pawn on c4 becomes weak, and yeah, black isn't actually equalizing here at all. So yeah, a lot of weaknesses in black's position, essentially. So that is this line. If you can ask yourself what happens if black doesn't play h5, if they try to go for typical queenside counterplay with bishop d7 and b5. Still very complicated, but it tends to favor white in these variations. Instead, h5 here is the best move, potentially threatening h4, but now we can actually castle. And this is the counterintuitive idea in the Sämisch, which is that if black ever plays h4, we can always bring the knight to h1. And actually, oftentimes we want to bring this knight to h1 anyways, because it wants to go to f2, supporting the e4 pawn, controlling the g4 square, and at some point we can even prepare f4, maybe f5 or e5. And so yeah, with the knight on f2, we can also consider playing down the g file, a very typical idea. King h1, rook g1, followed by g3, very nice position. For example, h3 can always be met with g4, and the h3 pawn becomes more of a weakness than a strength. Also, ideas of a g5 followed by f4 are very strong. So yeah, that's essentially this move. Black plays rook e8, a very slow move. Has been played a few times. I recommend checking. Okay, like I'll show the main line here, which is queen d2, preparing some bishop g5 potentially. So if black plays bishop d7, this is very slow. We can play bishop g5, b5, and then now f4, breaking through. Knight c4, we can take, play e5, d5, and f5. And we have ideas of putting the knight on e4. We can take on g6 followed by knight e4, and yeah, very difficult position here for black because we're breaking through. So instead of bishop d7, which is a slow move, knight h7 is best, covering the g5 square and preparing maybe the advance of f5. But we saw this in actually the introduction. We can voluntarily go knight h1 with the idea of going knight f2. For example, h4, knight f2, and now pawn to f5. This is typical, trying to create active counterplay. But now we see one of the main ideas of the Sämisch, which is of this variation of the Sämisch, which is this move king h1, with the idea that we want to play down the g file here. For example, there are a lot of moves, like knight f7 is probably best here, just like getting out of the e file, controlling the g5 square. But yeah, then you would like rook g1 here followed by g3 and still get a nice edge at the very least. Instead, queen e7 was seen in one game. Seen in the game Kelleres versus Benziger. Yeah, Kelleres, sorry. I think Kelleres is the Swedish player, Swedish grandmaster who won this game against the Greek IM, I believe. And yeah, we saw this position, rook e1, pawn to h2 was played, but yeah, knight takes h3, fe4, knight takes e4, just improving the knight's position, bishop takes, g takes, and now we have a clear target with rook g1 next, maybe f4, and yeah, the full analysis of this game is seen in the first video, so I recommend looking at that. And yeah, essentially white is doing quite well in this main line, in this old main line of the Sämisch after rook e8. But rook e8 is not the best move. Knight h7 is better. And this is the most popular, just still covering g5, but saying that maybe I don't want the rook on e8, maybe I want the rook on f8 to maybe support some f5 advances. So instead, I like the move queen d2, black can play h4, but now knight h1. And, if any other move like h3 can always be met with either g4 or g3, and I think, yeah, white is doing quite well here. After g3, knight f2, f4, still in the cards, very nice position. Instead, after f5 here from black, white can continue with the same idea of knight f2, bishop d7, king h1, and we will again go into this this typical idea of playing rook g1 followed by g3. And so at the end of the day, black can't really avoid this. Maybe, playing rook e8 is not best because it gives white the free play. The rook isn't exactly better on e8 than it is on f8, and so black should try to figure out some other play. But, with white's strong center, very impressive center, ideas of playing down the g file, clearly black is the one that's struggling here. So that essentially covers this this most challenging variation of the Sämisch, which is this move c5 all the way back over here, pawn to c5. We saw that pawn to e5 really shuts down this bishop, and black faces a lot of problems, but instead pawn to c5 here is very direct. There are two recommendations. You can either take the pawn at c5, getting into simplified endgame, where you can try to fight for an advantage, but it's not really there, but it's, it is a critical test. Instead, knight g2 maintains a lot of pressure, and without concrete theory here, black is gonna easily get into trouble. If you know more thematic ideas than black, then it's very easy for black to go wrong. So yeah, that covers this Sämisch variation. This is a fun topic for me to study. I really learned a lot about the different positions where, even transpositions to the Benoni, transpositions to the Maroczy bind, where we see which variations of which structure are actually okay. For example, why d5 here is not great, while why d5 in the mainline Benoni is actually good. So yeah, that essentially covers this series on the Sämisch. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, as I mentioned in the first video, I do not claim that there is an objective advantage, but there is a large practical one if you know this better than your opponent. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.